all our listeners for this webinar on COVID-19 impact on businesses in Pakistan. We're delighted to have with us a guest today, Mr. Ehsan Malik, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Pakistan Business Council, PBC. Ehsan, welcome to the webinar.
Assalamu alaikum, Arif. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today in particular, but also with the ACCA community. ACCA is an organization that the Pakistan Business Council has been collaborating with on a number of fronts. But today's topic obviously is hardcore economy. But we've also collaborated in terms of responsible business and so on. So as you know, we have a center of excellence in responsible business, and we've been working together.
That's right, Ehsan. So thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be collaborating on a virtual setting as well. Just for our listeners, the Pakistan Business Council was established in 2005 as an advocacy forum to improve the business environment in Pakistan. And yourself, Ehsan, you've been the chief executive since 2016. And prior to that, for the listeners, let me just share that Mr. Ehsan Malik was the Chief Executive Officer of Unilever Pakistan, and he spent about 24 years in Unilever in the UK, Egypt, and Sri Lanka. By profession, Ehsan is a member of the Chartered Accountants Brotherhood, so he's one of us, and he's also an alumni of Wharton and Harvard Business School. So great experience Ehsan has on corporate leadership and working in Pakistan. So we'll hope to tap into a lot of that as the webinar goes ahead. But first of all, Ehsan, tell us, in all your years of working in the corporate world, have you ever come across or experienced anything like the current global pandemic we're having now?
Absolutely not. I think this is totally unprecedented. It's unprecedented in terms of how many people it's touching, how many organizations it's touching, and the extent or the depth with which it is going to impact those organizations. I think the other unpredictability that comes in is nobody knows really how long it's going to last. So on the one hand, we don't know how long the medical crisis, the medical upheaval is going to last, but equally, we can only estimate, but we know for sure that it's going to last much longer in terms of its economic impact and the impact that it has on business. So no, I think the short answer to your question is I've never ever come across any crisis in my life. And I'm sure most people who live in Pakistan would also not have come across anything similar.
So, if we go back to 2008, when the financial crisis happened across the global financial institutions, how different is this to that, do you think?
Okay, so as you know, the 2008 financial crisis was the subprime crisis, which emanated from the United States and then spread into Europe and a few other countries. So it was something that impacted those economies that were heavily reliant upon borrowing, but particularly borrowing for the purpose of funding housing. So Pakistan, as you know, the level of mortgage financing is extremely low. It's hardly there at all. There's actually very little long-term lending, full stop. It's not just mortgage lending. Our reliance on consumer financing is also very low. So whilst we rely upon the West for large chunks of our trade, and no doubt when their economies get impacted, then our exports get impacted and our economy also gets impacted. But Pakistan, by virtue of the fact that it was not loan reliant or borrowing reliant, number one, and number two, we're not that well integrated. We were less integrated then with the global economy. We are a bit more integrated today, but even today we're not that well integrated with the global economy. So what happened primarily in the West did impact us, but did not impact us as severely as this is likely to do. But I could actually also go back and talk about a few of the crisis situations that have occurred in the recent past in Pakistan. So 2005 earthquake in Azad Kashmir or in Kashmir. Now, again, that was tragic for the people that it impacted, but it impacted a certain limited part of the country. And whilst the rest of the country all teamed up to help, the impact on the overall economy was not that severe. We can also think about the 2010 flooding that happened in Pakistan, which did impact a larger part of Pakistan, but again, largely around the river system of Pakistan. So yes, that again impacted the economy, but because it was localized, it was Pakistan, the world tried to help us and did help us. We were able to recover relatively soon. But this crisis, the COVID crisis, is a global crisis. It does not discriminate for or against a particular class of person, a particular type of business, or any countries. It is impacting everyone. So we have, the whole world is in it together. And so whilst we can look on the international community for some limited help, at the end of the day, we will have to cope ourselves.
So you mentioned earlier on, Ehsan, that because this is really unprecedented, we've never experienced anything like this at a global level. So if it's something that we are writing the script on as we go along, yeah. So business leaders are sort of unprepared. How do you think business leaders at the moment, those you've interacted with, how do you think they're faring at the moment?
Okay, so to in very different ways, yeah. I mean, everybody is negatively impacted. There are very few that are very positively impacted. I mean, it's not even worth talking about those that are positively impacted. Since 95% of the businesses are negatively impacted. I think the ones that are more negatively impacted are the ones that are in the informal sector. So we're talking about the small businesses, some of the medium-sized businesses, but more particularly the people who actually work for them. Now, why are they more impacted than the people who work for more organized businesses, the businesses in the formal sector? Very simple reason that their employment is not documented. They are part of the informal, undocumented economy. So when the government even tries to help them, there are very limited number of tools that are available. So on the one hand, if you don't pay taxes, so if the government gives you a tax relief, it means nothing to you because you paid zero, so you can't get a relief on zero. If you haven't borrowed money, so reduction in the cost of borrowing then doesn't impact you at all because you were not reliant upon that. And then of course, if you're an employee and you're not a registered employee with any of the social security systems, EOBI, and so on, that documentation is not going to help you either. So I would say that the deepest impacted are the smaller businesses, the medium-sized businesses, primarily the ones that were in the informal sector. The smaller or the medium-sized businesses that were better integrated with the as suppliers or as customers of the larger businesses in the formal sector are less impacted because those formal businesses have stepped forward, and I know many instances where billions of rupees have been made available into the supply chain. So this is in terms of payments in advance for supplies that are yet to be made, or provision of materials and goods, and sometimes services on credit, which hitherto perhaps was not the norm. And I'm thinking, obviously, maybe as one example of a company that I worked for 24 years, as you mentioned, Unilever, they never sold anything on credit. I'm sure they're not still, selling much on credit, but where required, they have sold on credit, right? They were taking a longer period to pay their suppliers, but now realizing the necessity for liquidity, they're stepping forward and they're funding those suppliers. So lots of businesses are being impacted, but some less impacted because of their better resources, and of course their heightened sense of responsibility.
So when you talk about that heightened sense of responsibility and and the larger organizations within Pakistan in the corporate world who maybe have that sense of responsibility towards their vendors and their supply chain, what do you think, if at the board level, what is it that the top leadership at the board level are preoccupied with at the moment when they sit down? What are the risks that they are really focusing on, and and how those risks are impacting the business, maybe in the medium to long term as well?
Yeah. Okay. So aside from the, by virtue of the position that I have at the Pakistan Business Council, and I come across, 82 of the largest corporates in the country, I also happen to be on a number of boards. And then so therefore, in terms of what you mentioned, how does the board look at the present crisis, and more to the point, what are they thinking about in terms of alleviating it? I think the number one priority in every case is safety, and safety of obviously starting with their own employees, right? So making the workplaces totally safe, according with the highest standards of health and safety. So that's number one priority. I think the second priority is identifying the key vulnerabilities that exist within the value chains. Which are the partners that are likely to be impacted more than others? How do you secure the most vital ingredients, inputs? What is it that needs to be done to ensure that the suppliers of those materials will remain solvent and will continue to supply? I think these are the kind of things that are uppermost in everybody's mind. So once that has been reasonably adequately taken care of, and I say taken care of because we live in a dynamic situation, so you can never totally take care of everything. Things change, circumstances change, so you need to be on your feet, constantly looking at the exposure points, and then trying to address them. But once you feel you've got a little bit of a sense there, then you start thinking about what can you do within the community, and the community can be defined, in my opinion, is best defined in the immediate environment that you happen to have your operations in. So as you know, about more than 60% of our members belong or have large industrial setups in and around Karachi. And in the industrial areas in Karachi, and I would think that that's probably true in large parts of the country, there are significant number of what we call kachi abadis around you. Yeah, so I can give you examples of Korangi, Landi, etc. There are lots of these kachi abadis are around there. So you need to start, and this is what businesses have done. They've reached out and provided provision of rations, hygiene products, and so on and so forth. So I think helping the community, focusing primarily on your own immediate environment to start, and then of course reaching out to the NGOs that work across the country. So I think broadly speaking, this has been the approach. So first, look at your own operations. Second, reach out to your immediate community. Third, then start, helping the NGOs that operate, well and beyond your immediate community into the wider world. I think broadly speaking, that has been the approach. Now, there are some fantastic examples where large amounts have been committed, as much as 1 billion rupees. But there are equally, I can think of, 5 or 6 where anywhere between 100 to 200 million rupees have been committed. And this I'm referring to is not helping your own employees, but this is trying to help the community. Now, coming back to helping your own employees, I think the number one priority, apart from creating the safety conditions, is maintaining livelihood. So in a lockdown situation where you have no cash flow coming in, you've got to find a way to keep these people employed and paid. And a number of large organizations, senior management has come forth and taken pay cuts in order to help continue to pay those on daily paid wages and so on. And of course, the state bank scheme, that came in the last few weeks, that has also helped significantly in funding. Now, of course, when you talk of the state bank scheme, maybe we can talk about that later. But when you don't have your own financial resources, you've got to go and borrow. And then so that scheme is also, I think, been quite useful.
So when you talk, Ehsan, about these steps that boards are taking, corporate leaders are taking. If I was to ask you what sort of capabilities on the board one may require going into the future. So, we normally have diverse boards where there's expertise covering finance, covering, production, covering marketing, etc., treasury. So all those functions, in a classic sense, are there on the board. But going forward, where we're faced with this new sort of paradigm, what capabilities do you think will be needed in the future?
Okay, so you mentioned that the boards always have functional capabilities, and those, for want of a better term, I call as hard talent, right? I think what is now required and what is required foremost in an environment in which we operate today, in a crisis environment, is the softer skills. A realization that what is the sense of or a heightened sense of responsibility, and of course, more to the point, how to then manifest and articulate and implement that heightened sense of responsibility. So realizing that whilst you have a responsibility to your own shareholders, there are a number of other stakeholders also in the business, or that have a stake in the success of the business, and expect something out of the business, and how do you take care of them? So employees, customers, suppliers, communities within which you operate, your third party, partners, etc. Realizing your sense of responsibility, and so that would be one set of skills, or one set of capabilities. I think the other major set of capability, which I think boards in general have, but this is the time when you want to use it, is to think long term. The temptation in a crisis is to think short term. How do I manage today? How do I manage now? Right? I think the more enlightened business leaders and the more far-sighted businesses are saying, okay, so this has happened. We have to cope with the present, but there is going to be a future. And what is the role that we as an organization, we as leaders are going to have in the future, and how are we going to go and manage that? I think that those are the two broad capabilities. So sense of responsibility and the ability to then translate that into action. And then, of course, the ability or the continuation of the ability to look forward, adapt, adopt, and take care of the medium to long term.
Okay, so before we go on to some of the macro questions, Ehsan, one of the questions that come to mind, and a lot of the current ACCA research has been done around digital and technology. So, how business models are changing to adopt technology, how customers are adopting technology. And certainly in these pandemic days, businesses that have adopted technology, both for communications, as we're doing now, using video conferencing and using digital, but a lot of companies which have adopted this technology are sort of faring well. So, they're able to supply their goods online, they're able to, transport those goods, etc. What is the future? Will companies now have to rapidly adopt digital and technology going into the future?
Absolutely. I think, to be very frank, a lot of the bricks and mortar companies, or bricks and mortar businesses in the past were giving lip service to digitization. I think this is a wake-up call where they now really absolutely must wake up and say, look, what is it that we need to do to improve our connectivity with our suppliers and our customers using digital means, but also harness the tools that have existed actually in the past also to understand consumer behavior, etc. The consumer product companies have been doing that for a number of years now, right? but the others have not really done that to the same extent. So deploying the technology to understand what the consumer needs, what the stakeholders want, what are the exposure points, um, how do you use the digital technology to manage risks, to limit exposure, to leverage your competitive advantage. I think all those things will come to the fore, and I'm sure the people who are now uh, having been liberated from the time that it takes to travel into business and the time that it takes to attend physical meetings, etc., are now reflecting and thinking about how to use time in a better manner to address both the demand side as well as the supply side of their businesses. So yes, I think digitization will accelerate, I hope, and I hope that we don't forget. Even if this crisis is over, let's say in the next 12 to 18 months, we don't just forget it and then try and go back to our usual sort of life, which is going to office 9 to 5 work and endless meetings.
Yeah, and also, Ehsan, what about on the monetary side? So, does there have to be a push from the government to adopt digital mechanisms for making payments, etc.? At the moment, I think we're well behind the curve in terms of adopting, electronic means to pay. Do you think the government really needs to invest in that side of things as well?
I think it does need to do that, but I think equally the government and everybody, I mean, I think including businesses, we all need to work to get more people either on some kind of a digital payment platform or to open bank accounts. I mean, the simpler one would be opening bank accounts, except it's become very cumbersome with all the AML and other considerations now. But getting your digital sort of platforms on your mobile phones, etc. I think would be very useful. I mean, I think all of us, we have people who work for us in the house, and perhaps they are now not coming, or we've told them not to come, but they're getting paid, right? And they're using multiple platforms to pay them. They're not physically coming here to collect the money. So necessity, has basically become the mother of invention, if that's the right way to put it. So at least those people have now been exposed to these methodologies of receiving payment, and I'm sure more can be. And I think here one should also give some credit to the SARS program and the relative success that they've had. I mean, I'm sure they can do a lot better and reach out to many more people. But the millions of people that they've been able to reach out, I think, is also evidence of when even a government which is generally regarded as slow moving in these things, when it puts its mind, can achieve quite a lot.
Yeah, with the ASAS program, that gives us a good segue into talking about, the state of the economy, because in order for us to have these programs, these safety net welfare programs, the government has to have adequate resources. Now, the main fiscal tool that government uses is taxation. The government taxes its working citizens, its persons, whether they're companies or individuals, and it really depends upon that supply of taxes in order to provide these services, whether it's a welfare service or whether it's health or education. The government is highly dependent upon the. Now, for many years now, Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio has been very poor. It's been in single digits, if not in double digits, but it is one of the weakest tax to GDP ratios, certainly in South Asia and globally. Now, therefore, there's an urge and an emphasis, to ensure that the FBR works efficiently. The FBR is able to tax those individuals and organizations which aren't in the tax net, which is certainly what's being advocated by the Pakistan Business Council, is to increase the capacity of the FBR to be able to collect fair taxes as well. But we're under tremendous pressure from the international multilateral agencies who are lending us money, bailing us out of the economic crisis we're in. But there are conditions attached to that, Ehsan. There are conditions attached to that. You've recently, the Pakistan Business Council has written to the IMF, which is a provider of billions of dollars to our economy, saying that even under the present conditions, they've got very hard metrics to be met. So what is your message? That we've got a lot of members, ACCA members, listening now, who want to understand the relationship between having a fair and good fiscal policy, but also at the same time not overburdening businesses with taxation. So how do we balance the two, Ehsan?
Okay. So first, very briefly, even before the COVID crisis, the tax collection target that had been set by the IMF, or as a conditionality of the IMF program, was a 47% increase in tax revenues this year. This year meaning the year that will end in June. Pakistan had managed to raise its total tax collection to the extent of 17%. So we were nowhere near the target, and it looked very clear that we were going to miss that target. Now, what was the reason for that? I think in devising the program, what IMF did was it front-ended a number of targets that Pakistan had to achieve as a conditionality, one of which was, of course, the tax target. Now, under normal circumstances, that would be fine. However, when you set a target, like for example, if you were to set me a target of running the marathon in record time, I can tell you I will not achieve it, because I will not even be able to complete the marathon because I'm not physically fit to run a marathon. It's like telling an organization that is not well resourced in terms of the quality of manpower or the quality of resources. I should never use the term manpower, because then that implies that there's no such thing as women power. So when you don't have quality of resources, when you don't have adequate knowledge of using digital technology to expand your tax base and your tax collection, if you're given a 47% target to achieve, you're not going to achieve it, right? And you're going to fail. So setting front-ended target without addressing the institutional capacity of the organization that is charged with collecting those taxes was a pointless exercise. And we were on record as registering our concern there. Now, come the COVID crisis, what we were hoping for was that there'll be some realism that might come into the way that the targets will be set. But we were horrified to see that the projection that the IMF made just barely a few weeks ago was a 34% increase in tax collection in the forthcoming year, which would be the financial year 21. And so we were horrified, and this was the reason why we engaged with the IMF to say that, look, this is totally unrealistic. We know that one year we failed to achieve the unrealistic target. Now you're setting us another unrealistic target. We also quantified that this would amount to 800 billion rupees worth of additional taxation. Now, if you don't have new taxpayers coming in to pay, who's going to pay that? It's going to be, who will be expected to pay that? It will be the existing taxpayers, which is, most of the people that the ACCA fraternity work for or work with or are composed of. Yeah, and that will be an extremely onerous task. Now, if I take a subset of business and just look at the manufacturing businesses represent 13% of the GDP, and they pay 56% of the total taxes of the country. So there's already a disproportionate burden on the few. What you're saying is now we're going to make it even more burdensome on the few to pay. And of course, this is all the time when the people that you're putting the burden on are also impacted by COVID. Because as the point that we made earlier, there's no one that is immune to COVID. Large businesses have also been impacted. and of course, small big businesses we know have been impacted. So it is totally unrealistic to set these targets, and we hope that the IMF will take cognizance of that. I think certainly the government has wisened up to it, and will hopefully reflect the concerns of the business when it renegotiates the target with IMF. Now, having said that, IMF is an extremely valuable partner for Pakistan. It is the lender of the last resort. Without their backing, we will not get the backing from any of the other multilaterals, whether it's World Bank, ADB, or and so on. We need them, we want them, and they have been extremely helpful, particularly when they gave this $1.4 billion that they recently gave as part of the rapid financing instrument. So we badly need them. PBC was one of the first organizations that actually advocated an IMF program, because IMF programs like the IMF program bring the discipline that is required. And Pakistan's economy requires fundamental reforms, and those fundamental reforms uh, would would be facilitated under an IMF program. But in our opinion, not in year one and year two. It would be over a longer period of time.
So, the IMF often becomes highly politicized, and therefore, it draws a lot of attention in terms of whether it's good for the economy, whether it's bad for the economy. So, in terms of, what the economy has to do to eventually wean itself off this international debt, Pakistan, looking at the bigger picture, throughout our 70-year history, we've been dependent upon international monetary multilateral agencies funding Pakistan. We've never been able to, unfortunately, come to a fiscal balance our books in a fiscal way or come into a surplus. What is it going to take for Pakistan to eventually, come out as an economy that is strong, that provides employment, that provides growth, that really can live off its own means? What is that going to take us on?
Okay, so the BBC has been advocating a thrust that we call Make in Pakistan. So let me just elaborate what Make in Pakistan is all about. So Make in Pakistan, of course, foremost is about creating jobs, but jobs jobs not in the sense that the government employs thousands and millions of people and does nothing productive with it, right? Jobs in a meaningful way, jobs that lead to value-added exports, jobs that create or encourage import substitution. So only when you are able to start taking care of a large percentage of your own requirements and become less reliant upon imports, will you be able to balance your external account. And balancing the external account is one of the major reasons why, or because we have an imbalance in the external account, is one of the major reasons why we keep knocking on IMF's door. The 13th time in the last 28 years. And Pakistan has actually been under an IMF program more than it has been outside an IMF program since its independence. Yeah, which is probably one of the few countries in the world that unfortunately has been suffering on this account. So we don't make enough goods that we require. We end up importing them. So our external account is always under pressure. And then we go back to IMF, and we keep repeating this cycle every 3, 4, 5 years. Yeah. Now, why do we do that? I mean, or rather, more to the point, what is it that the government needs to do to reshape our policy so that we can make more goods locally? So one was, of course, in the realm of taxation. You can't put too much burden on a few. You've got to liberate the fewer taxpayers that are otherwise compliant and make it easier for them to do business, and also bring the cost of doing business down. So that's a very broad sort of theme. We don't have time to go into detail on that account. The other thing that you have to do is you have to have an import policy which encourages local manufacturing. So I keep giving this example. If you take a pair of shoes, until recently, every component of the shoe could be imported by paying 20% duty, but the whole shoe in a ready-to-wear form, neatly packed, could also be imported by paying a duty of 30%. Now, if you have the same duty rate on raw materials, intermediate items, and your finished goods, you will not have production in a country that doesn't have as much of a scale as a country like China does. Yeah. So when they make millions of shoes, their unit cost comes down. Most accountants will understand that, right? But when we make fewer, hundreds of thousands of shoes, our cost of production will go up, right? So we need to have cascading tariffs. And so those cascading tariffs is a work in progress. The government has recognized that. They've set up a policy board. And of course, they've also recognized that the tariff setting policy, the purpose of tariffs should not be to raise revenue, which unfortunately it has been, but it should be more to shape the industry and encourage industry, in principle, manufacturing. So that is work in progress, and that policy board is now identifying, where to start with what raw materials and what intermediate items and so on. So that will continue. On the export side, for a number of years we had a static exchange rate which became uncompetitive. That has been addressed, but unfortunately, the evolution of the world economy has not been favorable in terms of value of exports. Our volume of exports have gone up or had gone up before the COVID crisis, but our values did not go up, and neither did Bangladesh's, and neither did Cambodia's or China's, and so on. So that was yet another pillar that has been addressed, and now we have a largely competitive exchange rate. So these are the kind of things that need to happen in order for us to fix the external account. To fix the internal account or the fiscal balance, obviously getting more people to pay taxes is of paramount importance. Now, unfortunately, I believe personally that the COVID crisis is actually going to be a setback, because the political will to pursue the smaller traders and the smaller businesses that have been impacted negatively by the COVID crisis is not going to be there, right? And this was another thing that we pointed out to IMF. We said, look, so you say 34% more taxes, 800 billion more rupees, you want more people to pay taxes, but within these more people are the people who have been very badly affected by the COVID crisis. The government is not going to be able to pursue. I mean, imagine going to your shopkeepers, your wholesalers, and saying, we know that shops remain shut for X number of weeks, X number of days, etc. But you still, you need to pay more taxes. So they're going to, in the best of times, they weren't cooperating, but in these circumstances, they're definitely not going to be in a cooperative move. So again, perforce, if that burden remains, is going to come back on the formal sector, which will be very detrimental.
And then you also touched upon one of the other sort of costs for businesses in terms of adding to the unit cost for Pakistan has been relatively high borrowing rates, that the banks are charging. Again, the Pakistan Business Council has been sort of advocating to the state bank to bring down interest rates so that you can ensure more investment. But that's a double-edged sword, because one often hears the governor of the state bank saying that that the interest rates are part of his monetary policy tool that they use to manage inflation. They also use it to manage savings for pensioners, etc. So how can we, as a country, we're trying to encourage savings. We're trying to make sure that we provide for pensioners. We're trying to make sure that inflation is kept in check so that the common man can get his supply of goods on a regular basis. But yet, our interest rates are high, which then curtail investment. How do we sort of manage this? Are the expectations too high from the central bank?
Okay, so maybe I could start by looking at the monetary policy tool, which obviously interest rate is a very important part of the monetary policy tool. Now, tell me, currently, of course, we've got 9% interest rate, right? The policy rate is 9%. Let's say if it became 18%, would we be able to get rid of the sugar crisis, the tomato shortfall, which is which is impacted by weather? Would we be able to take care of the price of flour, which is impacted by extra export that we did, which we shouldn't have done, and so on? Obviously, the answer is no. So inflation needs to be looked at in a differentiated way. There are two types of inflation. One is the demand-led inflation, which typically happens in countries which are heavily reliant upon consumer financing. So, in the West, in the UK or in the United States, people borrow heavily to buy cars, to buy domestic appliances, to buy houses also, right? So when you raise the cost of borrowing, it impedes the demand for such goods. When you lower it, it incentivizes people to go and borrow more. Now, we discussed earlier that mortgage lending and consumer lending is hardly there in Pakistan. So the effect of the monetary policy tool, which is traditionally to impact demand, it doesn't really quite apply in the case of Pakistan. Large parts of your inflation are induced by supply-led issues. So shortfall of production, weather crisis, mismanagement of your country inventory, ending up exporting more than you should have, etc. None of that goes away by having a high rate or a low rate, right? So when you talk of, let's say, the most recent inflation number that has come in is 8%. If you look a bit closer, you'll find that wheat, sugar, and a number of other food items account for about 1.5% of the total 8.5% inflation, right? That is not going to be addressed by interest rate. So you do not need to use the interest rate as a monetary policy tool to address inflation in a crude manner. You need to finesse that and to say what is the underlying demand-led inflation, and then come up with the appropriate interest rate. So in my opinion, today the non-cost push inflation is under 7%, right? So the interest rate requirement, or to quell an otherwise 8.5% inflation rate isn't really there. But today, of course, under a crisis situation such as the one we have today, no country in the world is regulating their interest rates according to inflation expectations. Yeah, all of them are regulating it or fixing it in order to help business to bring the cost down. As you know, in most of the Western countries, the interest rate is zero, right? So there is actually no cost of borrowing effectively. Of course, we're not there in Pakistan. So we believed in the past and we believe today, and there's going to be a monetary policy committee meeting happening this Friday, that the interest rate needs to come down even further, despite the fact that it's come down by 4.25% already. We think it should come down by another 2% to 7%. But any reduction from the 9% would be a welcome change. So that's in terms of and when you bring down the policy rate, you bring down the cost of borrowing for everyone who borrows, right? But then there are some that borrow already at a lower rate, right? So one State Bank of Pakistan would have to go back and relook at the rates that are currently being offered, or loans are being offered to them. So payroll one would be one of them. The State Bank had come up with a scheme to offer a fixed rate, 10-year loan for investment in plant and machinery for new projects at 7%. But if the policy rate is 7%, then I guess they would have to go back and relook at that, and hopefully that would come down. State Bank of Pakistan actually is perhaps one of the most listening organizations that we have today within the economic setup of Pakistan. And I'm not just saying that because they virtually agree to virtually everything that we've been recommending. So aside from lowering of the borrowing rate, which we recommended, which gradually they've addressed and hopefully they'll continue to address, we also recommended that they broaden this 10-year loan scheme. Don't limit it down to new investment, because today nobody is thinking of new projects. They're just thinking of sustaining existing projects. So happily, a couple of days ago, the State Bank of Pakistan said, well, yes, even investment in plant and machinery for balancing and modernization can avail of this kind of credit. On the payroll scheme, they had limited the total payroll that could be funded, and that impacted the larger employers. So on our recommendation, that has been now broadened, and loans up to 1 billion rupees can now be availed. So that means 1.33 billion worth of payroll can be funded through the payroll scheme, which for taxpayers is 3%. So so I think State Bank is a listening organization, and we hope they continue to listen.
Yeah, that's great. They've provided these incentives and reliefs to businesses, to reschedule loans, to take out new loans, to cover the payroll challenges at the moment. So they've done all that. Let's just talk about one of the other recommendations from the State Bank. I don't know whether it's the State Bank or the SECP, is to curtail dividend payments as well. So, when we come out of lockdown, obviously, whilst businesses provide employment, they provide us with products and services, ultimately they're owned, by shareholders, who are looking for a return on capital. Some shareholders are institutions. Institutions then provide pensioners to pensioners. And so there's a reliance on dividend payouts and on share value appreciation. What do you think in the post-COVID world is a shareholder in the post-COVID world? Are they likely to be hit by curtailment of dividends and also lower share prices? Is that going to be the post-COVID world?
So Arif, the restriction on payment of dividend only applies to banks, to the best of my knowledge.
Right.
And I think it's not so much a restriction; it's an advice that the State Bank of Pakistan has given to the Pakistan banks, saying that,
Right.
look, limit your payouts so that you are able to have greater financial resources to fund a crisis or a ridden economy. I think that was the broad advice. And then immediately after issuing it, they realized that a few banks had already announced the dividend, so they've allowed those banks to go ahead and pay. But there is, to the best of my knowledge, no limitation or restriction or even advice on other corporates on in the matter of payment of dividends. Now, of course, you've seen the March quarter results that came in, and I'm not talking about banks here now. Even the bank profitability for the quarter ended March was higher than for the same time last year, but was 19% lower than the preceding quarter, the December quarter. So even their profits have come down. But the profit levels of the rest of the industry, or for the broader sort of listed companies, was significantly lower than this time last year. So I'm not sure how many companies are seriously even thinking of paying dividends, because they would be, on the one hand, of course, you could pay the dividend and you could go to State Bank and borrow money to pay the payroll. On the other hand, you would have to do that trade-off calculation and say, should we keep this money and keep people employed and wait for better times, and our shareholders might understand, and so on. In any case, I think not many companies pay quarterly dividends. Most of them pay half-yearly dividends. So maybe a March quarter is not a good sort of reference point. But I think in the broader sort of realm, I think your concern is very valid. That shareholders deserve a payout, and some of them rely upon those payouts to sustain their livelihoods and sustain their the cost of living. And I think it would be wrong to mandate a dividend cut.
Ehsan, we've been talking now for about 15 minutes. So I'll just take a look at the live comments coming in, see whether there's any questions that we can share with the audience. And then we'll revert back to one or two closing thoughts from you. Let me just pick up some questions randomly. There's a question here from Awais Sati. My question regarding the construction of better economy. What is more important, industrialization of the economy or bailing out from the IMF? I think we've sort of covered that, but obviously every country wants to industrialize the economy and avoid bailouts, but you find yourself in a situation where you do have a huge current account deficit. And like you said, the IMF is a bank of last resort. you want to quickly?
Yeah. Okay. So by bailing out of IMF, I assume the question is, basically getting out of the program, right?
Yeah,
So not allowing IMF to bail us out.
yeah.
So no, I think it would be wrong for us to prematurely get out of the IMF program. Uh, I think a number of good measures have been taken, and the economy was verging towards stabilization. I wouldn't say that it totally stabilized, but certainly our current account was coming under control. Our government borrowing was also down in the sense that the fiscal primary fiscal deficit wasn't there anymore. So those things were moving in the right direction. So getting out of the IMF program I don't think is the right way to do it. The other part of the question, which is improving or the economy, etc. Obviously, that is the purpose of the IMF program, as well as, of course, the intent of everybody, in business, in government, and so on. So we must keep doing things that are fundamentally right. Look at what I mentioned about Make in Pakistan, encouraging more value-added exports, import substitution, and so on. So if you keep doing that, I think our economy would be on a sounder base.
Another question here, which is actually from a colleague. How do you feel are the SME businesses and the informal sector coping up with the COVID-19 situation? Again, I think we covered a little bit about that in earlier discussion. The SMEs traditionally they provide a lot of employment in Pakistan. They're an integral part of the supply chain, but they are badly hit at the moment. Do you think they're going to be quick to recover from this, Ehsan?
Okay, so the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, PIDE has done some surveys, and they said that of the 63.3 million people who are employed, one way or the other in Pakistan, 35% of them happen to be in vulnerable jobs, and majority of them are employed by the SMEs. So they said that their estimate of current level of unemployment is 16 million people. Most of them are emanating from the SMEs. So that's one sort set of figures that we have. And by the way, they also signal towards a more alarming figure of about potentially 35 million people that could become unemployed. But let's park that for the time being. The STPI, the Sustainable Development Institute of Pakistan, they've also done some study, and they've said that of the 3.8 million SMEs, they estimate that as many as 1.4 million SMEs will see their total business come down by 50% or more, right? And that as many as 1 million will basically go out of business. Yeah. So if as many as 1 million out of 3.5 million go out of business, that's a very significant percentage. Yeah. And they also said that between 2.5 to 3 million out of the 3.5 million business SMEs will not only require financial assistance, but other types of assistance also. And I imagine they did not, quantify what they did not describe what that, assistance might be. But this would be in terms of management know-how, in terms of a explicit policy change on behalf of on account of the large businesses to buy from the SMEs as opposed to buying from the larger businesses, getting more of them integrated within their value chains and so on. So that kind of assistance would also be required. So a very significant impact is going to come on the SMEs because they are the most vulnerable. They are if you like, at the bottom of the pyramid, the least resource in terms of money. Very few of them actually rely upon bank funding anyway. So, or the general reduction in interest rate, etc., doesn't really impact them as positively as it does the other rest of the business.
Yeah. Abdullah Fahad Masood is asking, does the digital online surge signal the gradual death of the wholesaler? If yes, isn't that expected to bring more documentation and more white money into the system?
I think broadly speaking, yes. The issue though is that wholesalers rather operate across the country. in many parts of the country, the internet is not available, or even if it is available, the connectivity, etc., would be poor. So I think wholesalers will continue to operate for some time. But yes, the trend towards which the question is pointing, I think, is very valid. There are, because I spent about 24 years in a consumer product company, we were always looking at ways of becoming more efficient in reaching and meeting demand. First of all, knowing where the demand is to begin with, but then also making our supply chain tuned so that the goods are where they're required, in the type of assortment, in the types of packaging, etc., that the customer might want. And we were constantly looking at digitization, and I know there are a number of I mean, for example, Unilever was one of the first organizations in this country to come up with the handheld terminals, these handheld devices to go and register the orders and monitor how efficiently the salesmen were moving around and how many outlets they called upon, and so on and so forth. And a number of organizations since then, third parties, have developed systems and processes where you can bypass a number of intermediate stages within the value chain, and wholesaler being one of them. So yes, I think the digitalization will definitely impact that, and should also positively impact the formalization of the economy. But it's going to take time.
It's going to take time, yes. There's going to be a gradual movement. And I suppose, the levels of literacy within our country also slow down the adoption of digital currencies and mechanisms to pay. We've got a question here from, looks like an international listener listening in on Facebook, Yashiro Nikaido, who's asking, can you shed details on rapid financial instrument? I don't really know what that is. Just sounds like a general term, Ehsan.
Okay, so rapid financing instrument is a tool that the IMF has available to help countries that are facing a particular crisis. So with the onset of the COVID crisis, there was a concern that Pakistan's exports would go down significantly, and indeed they have gone down. So they were down 8% in March, and they were down 54% in April. When I talk to our exporter members, I get the sense that for the June quarter, they're likely to be about anywhere between 40 to 50% lower than they were in the same time last year. So one concern was that the exports would go down. The other concern was that Pakistan may have to import more for reasons of health, and so the combined result of that would be pressure on the external account, and how can the country be helped. So they quantified that at $1.4 billion, and that was, I think, a very welcome assistance that Pakistan got, as a result of which the external account will largely be buffered. This, together with a number of other things that have happened, some of the other multilaterals have also stepped forward. Some debt repayments have been delayed, the G20 ones and so on. So together, the external account would be buffered or largely sort of balanced. But the RFI is really an emergency tool that the IMF utilizes in circumstances such as the ones that we are encountering today.
Great. And I think the last question we'll take from Inayat Rahman, who asks, hi, sir, how digitization will minimize economic impact, whether it will be an effective way to stabilize the supply chain in the long run. So I think this is building upon what we've already discussed about the importance of adopting digital and technology, Ehsan.
Yeah, it is. I think it cuts the time to react. I mean, often supply chains react to information that is outdated and has changed, and then so you have this impact of overestimating demand, then producing, and then the demand has gone down, and then you've got surplus available, which you have to then discount. I think those kind of things would be assisted significantly by digitization.
Okay, in order to ensure that we, take account of our women members as well. Amna Javed, who's a senior member of ours, she's asking, there is a trend found in businessmen of middle markets that they have taken advantage of the situation. Lower interest rates, etc., while have not spent from their big pockets. What measures have been taken or policies made to ensure that the available financing is not going to be accumulated to opportunists like the wealthy yet again? So, the additional financing being provided, etc. How do we ensure it gets to the right people? I think Amna's asking, instead of to the opportunists.
Yes. Okay. So if we can find this within, let's say, the payroll scheme of the State Bank of Pakistan, I think, unfortunately, the State Bank of Pakistan has to date not shared what type of people have applied for the advances, and more to the point, what type of advances have been approved. Yeah. So this smaller organization struggles to get those advances because they don't have collateral. And even if they have collateral, it's not in a readily realizable manner. So collateral in terms of land and buildings is not something that excites bank, because it's very difficult to get hold of those, to foreclose and so on. They're looking for readily marketable, sort of instruments, which obviously, if the smaller businessman had, he would not be going to borrow in any case, right? So I think the question is rightly framed in the context that the smaller businesses for which this would have been the most useful, unfortunately, is unlikely to be able to benefit as much as the more medium-sized or the better organized and the larger borrower who would have collateral readily available. But that's a sad fact of our economy. The informal sector has traditionally not banked, or even if they have banked, they have not availed of any funding. So there's no credit record. Put yourself in the shoe of the banker who has to look after his shareholders or her shareholders' interest. In walks, Ehsan Malik, who has never ever banked with them, and says, "I've got 20 people to pay today, and I need so much money." So the question would be, great, yeah, but give us some record. I don't have any record. What kind of record do you want? So give me some. Are these people registered for EOBI? I say, what is EOBI? Am I required to register them? No, sorry, they're not registered. They're my employees though. Yeah. So when you have this kind of situation, unfortunately, you will have dilemmas where some of the tools that are available for the government and state bank to help will not be utilized, or will not be utilized effectively. So the broader take on this is that people, one wake up call, I hope that people listen to that, is that they actively consider becoming part of the formal sector. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen, but I think some, even if it happens to the extent of 5% or 6% or 10%, I think that would be something positive that would come out of this crisis.
Yeah. And I think finance professionals, the accountancy bodies, their members can play an effective role in that, in the sense that if they are working for large organizations, no doubt they're already in the formal sector, but a lot of our younger members may be working for smaller organizations, and they can do the right thing by ensuring that business owners appreciate the importance of registering, the importance of getting licenses, the importance of compliance. All those things matter if in the long run you are going to grow a business. Ehsan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us about the economy, about the COVID-19 crisis and how it's impacting businesses. You've talked a little bit about how we're going to come out of this. We've got a lot of young people listening, so I just want to, at the end, just tap into your sort of experience and your insights. You've had a long career in the corporate world. You've had a long career as a qualified accountant. When young people are looking at their career growth now, and which has suddenly been impacted by, we may go into a depression. It's unlikely to be a V shape coming out of it. But what is your advice to young people now looking at their careers, at their job security? What sort of advice would you give them so that they can manage their careers from their mid-20s to their 60s?
I think one would be to not look at the short term, but look at the medium to long term. Identify what are the sectors of economy that are likely to sustain crisis such as this. I mean, there are some that we know are going to be suffering. Things like hospitality, travel, cinema, theater, etc. But there are sectors of the economy that are likely to much better. The realm of digitization, etc. There's a whole role to be played by accountants. So I think reflect on that. I think the other thing would be to understand that the organizations that will come out better, stronger, would be the organizations that would have a heightened sense of responsibility, and again a commitment to not only their immediate shareholders, but to a wider set of stakeholders. But then instill within your own mindset and your own thinking how you can reflect that into the actions that you will take as initially maybe middle managers, but then also as senior managers. So I would think, go back, look at sense of responsibility, look at how you can sustain businesses for the long run, get into sectors that will have relevance in the long run. I think briefly that.
Great. Thank you very much, Ehsan, for participating in this webinar. I hope the members who've been listening, the audience who've been listening, have enjoyed it as much as I have. I hope we can have you back soon as well to maybe talk about some other areas like ESG and sustainability. Fuad Hashmi at SERB. So thank you very much, Ehsan, for participating. I'm just going to hand over now to Rashid. Thank you, Ehsan. Thank you for participating.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it, and I hope the audience also benefited.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ehsan. Thank you.